Episode 6 of The Rings of Power is the best episode in the season to this point, in my opinion. And is that because it has a battle sequence and a lot of action and picks up the pacing? Partly. But the reason why I think that this is the best episode in the season so far is because it is just better storytelling than we have gotten in any other episode in the show to this point. I think that the more focused approach definitely helps that, as well as we begin to get some payoffs rather than constant setups, and we just get a better glimpse into our characters and a better understanding of them. And overall, I just think a lot of things work a lot better than they have in previous weeks. However, this is not a perfect episode. It definitely has its issues. Some that when you really think about them, it's kind of like that is a bit silly, and dialogue continues to be a bit inconsistent at times. However, I think in this week's episode, the good does outweigh the bad, and I rather enjoyed this one, and I want to talk about all of it in this week's review of The Rings of Power. All right, let's start off by talking about the things that work within this episode and that help make it a better quality episode than most have been to this point. And the first thing that I'm going to point out is the more focused storytelling. Just not having to juggle multiple perspectives, scenarios, points of view, however you want to think about it, is definitely something that helps this episode. I think jumping from the Harfoots to the Southlands to Numenor to Khazad-dûm gets a little bit jarring as you're watching it, and you're never really fully invested into a singular experience. And even though a lot of these stories in these episodes have tried to have unifying themes between all the various different plots going on at any given time, they still feel a bit disjointed most of the time. But in this more focused approach, you definitely are just more engaged. The pacing feels better. The overall payoff of the story feels better by the time you get to the end of it. And it also makes it a lot easier to summarize, right? Essentially, there is a battle in the Southlands. Adar and his orcs are attacking the Southlanders, and Galadriel and the Númenóreans are coming to their rescue. There is a battle that ensues. There is a back and forth between times when the good guys win and the bad guys win, and ultimately a big surprise at the very end. And with that, I will say in this review, I am going to be having full spoilers for the entire episode, so this is your spoiler warning. The next thing I think worked well within this episode is that I actually think the theme is presented pretty well here, and it actually has some decent payoff, right? This whole entire theme of the show, especially within Galadriel's arc, is in order to really be in the light, understand it, and to follow the light, one must first touch the darkness. And I know that certain people are going to feel certain ways about that particular theme, especially being in Tolkien's work, but that is the theme of the show, and that is essentially the arc that they're taking Galadriel on. And something that I found to be fascinating at the beginning of this episode is that there is a conversation between Galadriel and Isildur, where essentially we're seeing that side of Galadriel where the wisdom really is coming out, basically pointing out that don't be ashamed for the fact you are a stable sweet, because humble work can lead to greater things. In fact, she says that humility has saved entire kingdoms, and the proud have all but ruined it. Now, again, we have some foreshadowing in the life of Isildur, but also what I find fascinating with this situation is that Galadriel herself is in a position in this story where she is definitely being driven by her own pride and her own desires. And by the time we get to episode's end, we see that the Southlands was a successful kingdom for all of a few minutes before the bad guys, the evil, got one over and erupted Mount Doom and essentially destroyed the kingdom that the Southlands could have ever had, because now it is clearly in the hands of the evil ones. With that, I think it's also important to understand exactly what Udun means, because that's the title of this episode. And in Sindarin, which is a form of Elvish, Udun means the dark pit, or could even be translated as hell. So essentially, by the time we get to episode's end, we are seeing that Galadriel is in the bottom, the darkest of pits, the land of shadow, hell. And so essentially this should be the turning point for her character, right? She should start to get out of that darkness. We'll see how they continue to develop it, because she did have a very disturbing conversation with Adar after she captured him, which leads me into the next thing that I thought was very good about this episode, is that Adar is a pretty good villain. In this episode, we get a much deeper understanding of who Adar is than we have had to this point in the show, and I think that what makes him an interesting villain is because he serves as a good example of how those in Middle-earth fall into evil, and it wasn't really part of his agency, but more so a twisting from the Dark Lord Melkor, and the fact that he is not totally detached from the good things that were inherently in him before he was twisted over into darkness. And from his perspective, you can kind of sympathize where he's coming from. And of course, he's definitely a madman. He is evil. And there is this sequence that plays out between Adar and Galadriel that I found to be pretty effective, because he's able to really get under Galadriel's skin. Because once he tells her that he killed Sauron, whether he's telling the truth or not, I tend to think that villains are unreliable narrators. It just makes Galadriel turn to this super dark place, and he's very effectively getting into her psyche, and she says a bunch of choice words that are really dark, basically saying, I am going to hunt down all the orcs, I'm going to make you miserable, and then I'm going to leave you for last, which is definitely the words of someone who has evil intent. So the ability for villains to get underneath the skin of heroes is always an interesting quality to see come through. It's very much reminiscent of how you see the Joker getting underneath Batman's skin, right? Basically using the arguments of like, we're not so different, you and I, and we need each other. This type of manipulative talk that villains use in order to make our heroes the worst version of themselves. And while we're talking about the villains, let's talk about the fact that they really got one over on the good guys here, right? The bad guys essentially won in this episode, and I always like when that happens within storytelling, because it really does a good job of showing you the actual threat that you are up against. We know that Morgoth, Sauron are powerful beings, and we really need to see that play out. We see that play out within the Lord of the Rings trilogy in the fact that we have the Black Riders at the beginning, we have the journey into Moria, and we essentially see what the Fellowship of the Ring refers to as the long arm of Mordor at work. So essentially all this evil that happens to the Fellowship as they're on their journey is from the long workings of Sauron over centuries and centuries and centuries of essentially planting his servants all over Middle-earth and being able to have his influence throughout. And so what is important as we get invested in this story is for us to understand the power of the villain. And essentially what we get here is the fact that our heroes essentially just got outsmarted by the bad guys. Adar and the orcs implemented a little bit of a Trojan horse strategy with the Southlanders, which got them in a situation where they were cornered and allowed Adar to capture the blade hilt. And then Adar had the wherewithal to have a secondary plan in order to make sure that Waldreg was able to get away and activate the unlocking of Mount Doom via the trench system that they built. And by the time we get to episodes end, the bad guys have won, and the orcs have now turned the Southlands into the Land of Shadow. And that's where I'm going to switch over to some critiques. And the first thing I'm going to mention is that this does make some changes to the lore, definitely like a lot of changes to the lore. All of this is kind of in the imagination of the showrunners with how Mount Doom erupts for the first time, the blade hilt, all of that. These are things where liberties are taken, and that's going to bother some people more than others. As far as where I'm at with this show, I've kind of decided that, hey, these things are going to happen. Does it effectively help the story or does it hurt the story? But in this case, I actually really didn't have as much of a problem with it. But for people who do have a problem with lore changes, I don't think there's really anything in this episode that's going to change your mind on the direction of the show. My next critique is that even though I thought that the battle sequence was fine and entertaining, I thought the twists and turns throughout the battle were definitely the most interesting part of how this episode played out. However, I just was extremely distracted by one element that I think is a massive oversight in how this show plays out, in the fact that Bronwyn, for some reason or another, is on the front lines. Now, the reason I have a problem with this is that Bronwyn is a healer, an adept one at that, right? She's known to be one of the better healers, and everyone takes their ill animals to go see her, and she can help, right? That is her skill, and the fact that you have her on the front lines of battle just doesn't really make any sense, and I found that to be really distracting, because it seems that this show really just wants to put its heroes in the action to fight the battles, but kind of doesn't really understand that that doesn't make any sense within the actual tactics of battle, because in battle, people are going to get hurt, and someone who's your most skilled healer, the most valuable thing that they can do is be available to tend to the wounded, and that doesn't make them a lesser leader. I feel like there's always this idea within storytelling that the person who is the most effective leader is the one carrying the biggest sword, and I don't think it would have taken away from the leadership of Bronwyn if it's like, hey, the thing I'm best at is healing. I will tend to the wounded. Arondir, you lead the armies. That makes a lot more sense to me, and they can still do pretty much all of the same things within the story, but have just made it make more logical sense. You can still have her get hit by the arrow and take a wound because maybe she's tending to the wounded on the battlefield after they think they've won. And you could even have her rescue Arondir as maybe she comes out because she thinks the battle has wound down and finds that he's getting attacked. You can do all of the same things, but maybe have just a little bit more logic in there. I found that to be a rather distracting element. And then my next critique is that the show just continues to have elements of distracting dialogue that just kind of just take you out of the moment, like that feel a little bit forced by the writers to try and use too much metaphorical language, or to try and be too flowery, or to try and emulate Tolkien too much, with having lines where Galadriel is stopping Halbrand from killing Adar and saying you aren't going to quench your thirst with seawater. And it just kind of felt like a weird thing to say in a moment of urgency where you're just trying to get somebody to stop doing something because you need this person alive. And the next bit of clunky dialogue I'll point out is Arondir's bit where he's talking to the Southlanders, trying to get them all pepped up and basically saying that if they can believe that they'll win, they're going to win. And he asks them, do they believe it? And they're just like, yeah. And then he asks them again, do you believe it? And then they all are like, yeah. And to me, it feels like something out of, a feel-good sports movie, or something that you would hear one of those very charismatic preachers say at like a massive event or something. And it feels a little bit corny to me, and it kind of took me out of it. It's nothing like Aragorn talking to the armies before the Battle of the Black Gate, or Theoden before the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. These are things that are iconic, and you kind of have this. And I'm not saying that this had to live up to that, but it just could have been a little bit better, I thought. And these experiences where the dialogue is distracting take you out of the story. And I feel like there's a handful of moments that's happened with in this show, and that's been a pretty consistent element. And I think going forward in their seasons, they really have to tighten that up to make it just feel more consistent as we are watching the show. But to this point, I think that on a story level, the execution was much better. I thought that on a character level, the execution was much better. Let me know what you guys think in the comments of what you thought about this episode. Is it the best? Is it the worst? Is it continuing to be middle of the road? I'd love to know. Be sure to subscribe to Parallel Quest if you want more Rings of Power content. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you guys next time on Parallel Quest. Bye-bye.